Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Red Gaming Today video, we're going to be discussing and analysing the Nvidia CES 2019 conference, along with looking at the performance numbers of the RTX 2060 graphics card, along with discussion of the pricing. Going into CES 2019, much of the hype and anticipation has been firmly on the shoulders of AMD. There is an awful lot of expectation of what we're going to be seeing from Team Red, both in terms of the CPU and GPU markets. I think it's fair to say that on the CPU side of things anyway, AMD have already put so much pressure on Intel, it's really a case of can they continue that? Can they continue that onslaught? With the possibilities of, let's say, even a 12 or 16 core Ryzen CPU being actually rather mouth-watering when you think about it. And on the GPU side of things, well, what are we going to be seeing AMD counter the recent RTX 20 series of GPUs? Well, from Nvidia, it has been pretty much business as usual, with a couple of small announcements to go along with that, plus a rather large announcement which is really cool for gamers. We're going to start things out with the mobile side of things and the RTX 20 series of cards for laptops. Now, I won't go through all of the specifications of these cards verbally because, well, frankly speaking, they are identical to that of the desktop counterparts. Number of CUDA cores, the number of texture mapping units, and so on and so on. All identical. The key difference here is the clock speeds. We see drastically reduced clock speeds for the mobile market. This, of course, is simply to fit within the constraints of the laptop design. I would be interested to see what manufacturers of laptops, there's around 40 models if memory serves, will allow in terms of overclocking, or rather what the cooling solutions they've implemented will allow. And of course that would negatively impact battery life, but I do know that some people simply do not have the space or don't have the usage scenario where a desktop makes sense. Therefore, having a laptop and then being able to plug that into, let's say, your TV if required, is kind of a cool option. So the laptops, of course, vary in price, and you see all of the usual suspects in terms of the vendors which work with Nvidia. So if you want HP or Acer or whatever, then you should be pretty much good to go. It's cool, but once again, this was an announcement that we were certainly expecting. There were, however, announcements on the monitor side that I don't think anyone was expecting, and that is Nvidia's decision to embrace the open standards. Nvidia have pledged to support the VISA display protocol, which is a VRR, also meaning variable refresh rate technology. Now, according to Nvidia, they are going to be releasing support for these monitors through driver updates. So far, just 12 monitors out of around 400 monitors have been confirmed to support G-Sync with this open technology. But with that said, Nvidia have wrote to members of the press, and they have confirmed that you can actually manually enable this in the drivers when they drop. But of course, they simply cannot guarantee that your particular monitor will support the technology. So while in theory any adaptive sync monitor should work and be able to enable the G-Sync technology on that monitor, your experience will certainly vary depending on the monitor that you do own. But the driver does drop on January 15th, and Nvidia are pledging to devote a lot of resources to maintain this standard and continue to update. Now, personally speaking, I think this is really cool. According to Nvidia, the list of monitors which are supported will continue to grow, and the experience with poorly supported screens will improve, as they are devoting an awful lot of engineering resources to ensure that this is the case. Regardless, the driver itself will initially launch on January 15th, so it's not too long into the future at all. By far, I think this is one of the biggest wins for consumers that we could have hoped for. It means that you are much freer now to purchase a monitor, and you don't need to worry about, well, I've just spent like $400 or what have you on a particular screen, and now it's like, well, I'm now going to go with Nvidia card if, for example, you purchased a monitor originally for an AMD type of GPU. So it's going to be interesting to see, from my point of view, what happens with G-Sync, as in the traditional G-Sync monitors that we all know right now. Is it possible that Nvidia are going to kill the initiative? Is it possible they're going to scale it back? Because one of the key concerns, of course, of G-Sync is pretty simple. If you own a G-Sync monitor, now it is not going to be compatible with an AMD and eventually Intel GPU. Oh, and that's the other thing here as well. Don't forget, Intel are pledging to support this standard with their discrete line of graphics cards. So, what would have happened, of course, if Nvidia had not jumped on this early, is that they would be the odd duck out. So I think that this is a win for consumers, it's a win in terms of Nvidia's PR, and frankly, it just, for me, brings questions of what Nvidia are going to be doing with the dedicated G-Sync line of screens, because once again, you cannot run those, at least currently, unless perhaps there's an update or something that happens, which I highly doubt. You cannot run those on, let's say, an AMD GPU. So once again, in theory at least, this might kill off a lot of interest in Speaking of January 15th, it's an important date for another reason, and that is the much touted RTX 2060 will indeed be available for purchase. And you guessed the pricing, $349 US. And of course, price does slightly vary depending on your region. The specs that we've seen leaked are accurate. We have 1920 CUDA cores, 30 ray tracing cores, 240 tensor cores, 120 texture mapping units, 48 ROPs, and with GDDR6 memory at 14 Gbps, and with a boost clock of 1680 MHz for the Founders Edition, and that is with 192-bit bus with 6 GB of memory. So then, the specs are what we expected, and that's not surprising because the leaks ahead of this announcement. Currently, I am still in Seattle, although I'm flying back to the UK on Thursday, which means I shall arrive on Friday. But if we look at performance numbers from other reviewers, you can see that their numbers do closely match that of Nvidia. So what we have here, of course, is a card which basically matches the performance of a GTX 1070 Ti plus a couple of percent depending on the game. Some games it's slightly ahead, in other games it's slightly, well, not ahead. And so it immediately brings up questions of, is this card good value for money? There are a couple of things that we need to take into consideration. The first is that it only has 6 GB of VRAM. That has certainly been a criticism I've seen online quite a bit, and honestly it's a criticism that we don't really know right now how it's going to scale over the next year, because obviously VRAM usage in games could certainly differ in, let's say, 6 months or 12 months as games become increasingly heavy in textures or improve in graphical quality. We just don't really know what type of impact that's going to have. But for the here and now anyway, we do have a card which is, yes, faster than an 8 GB card, the GTX 1070 Ti. The other thing we need to take into consideration is whether this card is a good price or not also depends on your perspective, because there are a lot of arguments online which basically sees the card in one of two different ways. The first is that it's outperforming, technically speaking, the GTX 1070 Ti. You can overclock this GPU as well. I'm looking at multiple reviews and most people have agreed there's not that much left in the tank. So let's say on average 100, 120 megahertz, maybe 150 if the stars align, but we'll have to wait for custom AIB variants of the card. So speaking squarely about the Founders Edition, around 100 megahertz in the tank, and as usual with a Turing GPU, 600 to 700 megahertz on the memory is certainly not uncommon. So you're looking at a card which is roughly on par with a 1070 Ti, possibly up to a 1080, depending on the levels of overclocking. So if you look at it at the perspective of like, well, this card is, let's say, 1070 Ti class performance, and right now the price of the 1070 Ti along with the 1080 and other GPUs is going up because obviously Pascal is end of line, then this card is a pretty good value for money proposition. It has ray tracing, it's got DLSS, but of course ray tracing performance is not where it should be, and I don't know how many people would want to enable ray tracing to then have, let's say, 1080p 60 FPS when you could not do that and have higher frame rates or possibly run at 1440p. But of course that's down to your usage scenario. There are developers out there which are pledging to support DLSS along with ray tracing, and depending on how that works, currently, for example, with Final Fantasy 15, it basically scales it to from 1440p to 4K. A better option would be 1080p to, let's say, 1440p, but how that works, what the performance impact is going to be, and so many other questions we just don't have answers for right now. So that is an unknown factor. The fact is, though, that if you're looking at it from the perspective of this card is a 1070 Ti class GPU, but has a couple of extra features and is available right now, then, you know, Turing, it's a pretty good value proposition. But you can also look at it the reverse way, and that is that cards in the 60 class have traditionally been much cheaper. The 960, the 1060, the 760, and so on. I'm not going to go back into the, the history of, humanity to go through all the GPUs here, has been around 199 to 250 US dollars, which, if you're bad at maths, means that you're spending about $100 more. Performance uplift as well is roughly what you would expect from one generation to another, around 40%. Sometimes you've seen slightly more, sometimes you've seen slightly less, but on average around 40 or 50% from one generation to the other is what you would expect, and therefore the card is hitting roughly the performance targets you would expect in that instance. The problem is the price is also scaled as well. So if you're looking at it purely of like, well, this card is way more expensive than its predecessor in the same, tier, then I would agree that this is not a particularly cheap GPU. And some of this blame could certainly be placed on the shoulders of GDDR6. I believe Amy covered a story yesterday or the day before that GDDR6 memory prices is like 70% higher compared to, let's say, R5. The bottom line is, it doesn't matter why the price is higher, it's still higher, which means that we have to pay more money. You did have some 1060s in the past that were like $300 US because they were the custom cards and they had heavy overclocks and all that stuff. And you could kind of make that argument. But when the base card is $350 and therefore some of the high-end AIB cards are going to be $400 US, well, I think you get where I'm going with this. So in that regard, there's certainly some problems, and it does beg the question, are we going to see the GTX 11 series that we've heard so many rumors about? It didn't happen at CES, perhaps because AMD are waiting in the wings with Navi, and therefore Nvidia want to see what happens with that. But there is also a lot of questions of what's going to happen in regards to AMD's lineup at CES 2019. AMD themselves have been cutting the price of Vega 56 and 64s, and once again, there's two ways you can look at that. I'm going to ignore the possibility of a Vega 2 launch or something really high-end for a moment and focus on the mid-range, because that, of course, is where most people want AMD to save them, the so-called Navi launch. And the price cuts for the 56 and 64 could mean one of two things. One, AMD are just looking to cut the price of the cards to shift inventory. That does make sense, right? Shift the inventory, get rid of it, because let's say Navi comes out, who the heck is going to want to buy an RX 580 or a Vega 56 for MSRP right now when Navi would be considerably faster? It would just not work. So get rid of the cards. That's another reason possibly we've seen some of these bundles, but obviously also to compete with Nvidia, where we see, let's say, Devil May Cry or Resident Evil 2 coupons where you can then download the games. The other way to look at it, though, is that AMD do not have Navi ready for launch at CES 2019. This would mean that the only way for them to compete in the short term would be Vega 56 and 64 and to cut the price as much as possible. Which one is it? Honestly, I do not know. We've heard rumors from, yes, the cards are going to launch at CES 2019, to they're going to be announced at CES 2019 with a launch, let's say, a month later, all the way to Navi is not going to launch until the third quarter of this year. So which one pans out to be true? We can only wait less than 48 hours. Getting back to Nvidia and the RTX 2060 and whether I think this is a great card, there are certainly some benefits over Pascal, like compute performance has certainly gone up, which means that if you are someone who does, let's say, physics work, or you do some CAD work, and therefore it would benefit you to have that, and you're trying to make the decision right now of they're upgrading from an older GPU, let's say a 960, then certainly going the Turing route and buying an RTX 2060 does make a measure of sense. With that said, I would highly suggest you see what AMD do announce, and either way, it does kind of suck that we are still being charged $350 for a mid-range GPU. I really am hoping that Nvidia's lower end SKUs, once again the 1150s and the 1160s, do release over the next couple of months, but I personally believe that they're waiting to see what AMD do. With all of that said, let me know your thoughts on their event, that is Nvidia's event, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves, and bye for now.